talk. Hey everyone, morning monsters. As you can tell, I've still got a bit of a frog in my throat. It's still attacking me, but I'm very much in the dreams headspace. But I don't want this book review to go fall to the side. So let's do a quick book review in dreams, and then tomorrow we can talk about what our next book will actually be. So here we go. So Rainbow's End by Vernor Vinge. Now you're going to see some terrible sculpting while I do this because I'm going to try not let it slow me down because I want to what's the word for it? Focus on words. There we go. Vernor Vinge by Rainbow's End. I don't know if any of you actually ended up reading it, but it really is spectacular. So I reread it. So I have read it before, but it really is one of those futurist sci-fi books that doesn't have a single concept and goes, this is the single concept that has changed in the future. No, it has about 20 odd things that it talks about having changed, and that actually makes like a big difference because it just gives the world some what's the word for it? It gives the world some more believability, and there's a bit more to it. So the premise and setup is a famous poet is very old, and he has very old, and he is pretty much like suffering dementia and dying, and he comes back from the brink thanks to modern medicine. And he is basically our framing device for modernity because he's the character who doesn't know about all the crazy modern things, and through him we learn about the modern world. So this is often like a really handy thing to have someone drop in from another place or in the world and to be, new to it all. And so, as I say, he is our framing device for that whole discussion. It helps that his family, his son is in the military and his son's wife is in the military, because the author wants to talk about a lot about how military intelligence changed. Now, something that I had totally forgotten when I recommended the book, given the state of coronavirus and how everyone is very concerned about a lot of stuff in that sphere, was that the book has this whole bioterrorism element, and it actually opens with a section about so I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember when computer hacking started entering into the news. It started to become a thing that the news talked about. People were very, very scared. A lot of the fear was because of the fact that normally you're afraid of adults, right? And normally you're afraid of like large terrorism organizations and stuff. And basically in the 70s especially, not so much the 80s, it happened in the 80s and it was an element of pop culture in the 80s, but the real fear was more in the late 70s, maybe early 80s, was this fear of computer hacking and amateurs in the basement basically launching nukes and things like this. It was largely ridiculous looking back on it, but people were very intimidated by it. And to be honest, one of the things that sort of set the tone was Spielberg's War Games. So this starts off with what I would call the modern equivalent of that, which is DIY genetics. People cooking dangerous things in their basement, basically. That is a whole funny concept in of itself. But it's a thing that is going to become a reality in the nearish future. And because the author writes a lot about futurist and singularity stuff, he starts off with that. So he starts off by talking about like how there was sort of a mild cold virus outbreak that sort of spreads around, and how the EU was slow to detect it, but hobbyists and crowdsourcing, and he goes into the whole sort of Wikipedia culture, were quick to discover the virus, and he goes into sort of the failing of the apparatus and how difficult it is for like all these military intelligence agencies to dig into the problem and track down all these rogue genetic things. And this is really, as I say, the setup. But anyway, then we immediately see the positive side of sort of these genetic advances. And I really like when he is dealing with the poet's revival, he talks about the whole God's minefield concept, the fact that it's unlikely we'll develop a golden bullet that just solves aging, right? We may have sort of a penicillin moment where we develop a kind of anti-lethargic that attacks T-cell degradation or something like that. That has broad spectrum applications. But the more likely reality is that we'll get into a place where there's a bunch of, I'm just going to call them old people diseases, where we get cures or treatments there. And that's the approach he takes. And it's a lot more realistic when you actually look at how R&D and chemistry and stuff works. But it's really interesting because it basically means the writer has to deal with this uneven world where some people can get age treatment and some people can't, and not everything applies loosely, and the culture is very much in a state of flux, learning to deal with the fact that old people can stay around longer. And this is actually something we're already dealing with now in our society, which is why I found the book so interesting. If you were to deal with, say, a baby boomer would not normally, like their parents and the generation before them, would not need to retrain much. They would come up with a career in university or whatever, and they would probably stay with that career their entire sort of working life. They may change career once, but the chances of them actually shifting around career, it's a relatively new concept to like where we are now as millennials or Gen Xers or Zoomers or whatever, is that we kind of expect that we'll have multiple careers. Estimates are as high as sort of 5 different careers professional as the average for the millennial generation. It's kind of expected you shift around. So even when you stay in the same career, like I've stayed in video games for the last so many years, there is a lot of retraining that goes on, and my day job looks very different to what my day job looked like not so long ago. So anyway, that's a very interesting concept, and as I say, the book is 10 years old, I think, maybe 15, I forget. So it is talking about a lot of stuff that is quite revolutionary. But the thing I remember it for is, as he sort of gets up, one of the modern advances that he has to start learning, and I think this is what got the book a lot of attention recently, was the augmented reality side of it. So he has to deal with the fact that technology is largely through these contact lens and through wearable technology. And he takes he's clearly spoken to a lot of, the author is a computer scientist, but he also clearly consulted with a lot of professionals in various fields, because he talks about methods of coding where you move your body, you twitch your muscles and stuff, and basically through machine learning you train those muscle movements and those twitches into keyboard movements. So you can basically encode small gestures into your clothing and into your wearables that are unique to you. So little muscle twitches, involuntary stuff, small stuff that other people won't notice. But this means, and also because everyone's using these contact lenses, AR stuff, which again, it's near future tech. You know, it's not something you're going to buy in the next 5 years, maybe. But you'll start seeing it at CES in 5 years. In fact, you'll probably see it at CES a bit sooner. As in, like, there are already like R&D. There are already R&D patents around this. There's already cool stuff happening with this micro LEDs. You know, it's a developing field. Like, as I say, everything in this book is near future tech. And this is really interesting because much like when the internet started happening and you had a whole bunch of seniors sort of left behind, because usually innovation happens in the physical space, right? So you can't help but run into cars because they're in the street, okay? So previous generations innovation have been very physical. The internet somewhat did become a physical space because, as I say, you'll go to Tesco's or whatever, and you'll see sort of self-checkout lines, and you'll see the internet manifest into reality. But there's still a large portion of the internet that is purely conceptual and happening in the digital realm, and that has made it hard for some people to adapt to the sort of changes, and it also makes it easier to ignore the changes, because like, for instance, a lot of fashion trends now happen purely on Instagram, right? And you've got things like, where in Japan previously Japanese fashion would, let's give him a booty, Japanese fashion would always appear in oh, my brain is gonna totally blank now. Japanese fashion would always appear in not Akihabara street. My wife loves it. We stayed there in Japan when we went to visit because she wanted to go shopping for the Japanese fashion, and I spent practically every day in that street, and my brain is anyway. There's a fashion street in Japan that I'm blanking on. Everyone used to go there on the weekends to basically show off their latest outfits. So if you wanted to know what was going on in the world of Japanese fashion, you basically just had to hang out in the street on the weekends, and you would see like what was hip with the kids, and you would see what the latest fashion trends are, and they would very physically manifest in that space, right? Whereas now what's happened is a lot of the physical magazines that were tracking this, a lot of street photography and the street fashion culture there has died down a lot because, frankly, people found it more convenient and comfortable and affordable and accessible to do it on Instagram. And so this whole fashion movement's living and dying on Instagram. Now, I'd argue some of it is a bit disingenuous, because is it really a fashion movement if you're only wearing Harajuku? Thank you. Is it a fashion movement if you're only wearing it in your bedroom? Which some of these fashion movements, that's largely what's happening, which is a little bit sad. A lot of this is because of like teenage culture and like people getting overly worried about predators. But that's a different book we should talk about, which is called It's Complicated by Daniel Boyd. Very good 10-year research project by a very respected person. But back to Rainbow's End by Vernor Vinge. So Rainbow's End, the fascinating thing with it is now you have the next modernity revolution coming, and not only is it largely ephemeral because it's largely digital, but it doesn't manifest in the real world like you see. In fact, in some ways, if you weren't partaking in the mixed realities that these contact lenses and other devices provide, then it looks like technology is almost falling to the wayside, right? Because you're not seeing view screens and televisions everywhere because everything's plastered in a virtual space. And so that is interesting as he kind of returns to reality and has to deal with it, because I feel like it's an ultra expression of what we dealt with in the internet revolution. But as I say, I think it's likely that in the future revolutions that we have coming, that it'll only get worse, this kind of problem, right? Like our generation, when we have to deal with the new and shiny, we likely won't have something as obvious as our parents did, really. Okay. And that's a whole interesting concept in of itself. So anyway, he comes up and he's trying to deal with modern life, and he struggles, right? As you would expect he would struggle. But the other thing that comes to the fore is that, he was basically a pretty shitty person when he was famous and stuff. And he deals with a lot, like I think the writer's writing from experience. He deals with a lot of the sort of angst of getting old and your friends dying, and as you leave the academic space or the professional space you're in, where a lot of your contacts, a lot of your friendships may have been entirely what's the word I'm looking for? They may be entirely functional relationships, i.e. they're once you leave your given career or your given profession, those people may no longer want to actually to interact with you or speak with you. And so he deals a lot with that. He deals a lot with sort of the loss of friends and the loss of people in his life. But anyway, he gets back and he goes back to sort of adult schooling, and now the ensemble cast is introduced. As I say, there's the family, which I already mentioned, the younger daughter. There is a fellow kid at school who's on the remedial track, which is the same track that the adult education class is on, because they just wouldn't be able to keep up with modern schooling, which is very equivalent. Like, everyone always wants to say, back in my day, school was actually hard. And while I agree there are some issues around universities and for-profit and some of the things that have changed up there, the reality is that most modern schooling is a lot harder than the schooling that people went through, and kids are dealing with more complex topics at a younger age. And that's a really good thing. That's like a good place to be in, and that's the way it should be. But it does mean that if you, as an older person, go back into education, other than the only thing that sort of keeps you up is the experience of that you already have. Oh shoot, that can't do that. Let's delete that. There we go. The only thing really keeping you up is the experience you had. Like, you're unlikely to, and also you've lost some brain plasticity and stuff. Now there are drugs, and there are things that, in theory, if we were developing anti-ethagics, we would have to deal with. But that's the sort of trouble that this guy goes back into. And as I say, that's why the kids in his class are interesting. That's why the kids in his class are on the remedial track, so to speak. But anyway, back to the book's plot and why the book's interesting, because I want to just talk about the plot through so we can get the plot out the way, and then we can talk about why it is so fascinating. So, as I mentioned at the start of the book, it does deal with the this virus that happens, okay? And this virus, the kicker of this virus is that it was very targeted. It was engineered. And when it showed this ad at a particular physical event for Honey Nougat, it what's the word? It triggered action, right? So basically, ad was hyper effective, and you'll go like, why is that so worrying? And I like where the author approaches this, because he basically acknowledges that even today we have forms of mental manipulation that are quite sophisticated but quite subtle, and you know, basically we have ways of gaslighting people that, you know, people like military intelligence do actually use when they're going after sort of targeted psyops, right? It's a thing where you're okay. Let's just plop that down in the center. Okay. I'm just gonna pad that there, and then I'm gonna pop out. I'm just gonna try center this as best I can, so the mirror plane is actually going to be useful for me, right? So anyway, and he talks about like sort of some of the existing psyops things, but the thing that was so powerful by this is it had a biological component, and it was accurately triggered, and it was a lot more effective than previous techniques have been known to be. Oh, actually, I don't like that. So anyway, he goes into all of that, and that is fascinating as he digs into it. And this is why military intelligence, particularly a European alliance of military intelligence, is hyper concerned, and they're doing something. So in the background, you have these military intelligence characters doing this stuff, and you're like, Claire, I thought you told me this was about an old poet sort of readjusting to life. And it is, because both this kid and this old poet get trapped up in the connivings of the military intelligence people, because they get used as cutouts and cat's paws by military intel. Because you forget, like, when we did intelligence operations in the Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union did intelligence operations in the West, and, you know, to this day, like with Afghanistan and everything that happens, you use real people on the ground, and they have real lives, and you can affect these lives in a whole bunch of weird ways. So that's really where it comes in, and I think it's also just to give the book a bit more excitement, because it's like, oh wow, the whole espionage angle. Anyway, it goes through that, and these guys get involved, but the European intelligence agencies, much like modern intelligence agencies, don't deal directly with the thing. As much as possible, they try to isolate through contracting companies, and in this case, they subcontract to an AI, well, to a character named Rabbit, who's very, very suspicious. And I kind of just revealed my hand there about one of the topics I find really interesting. So one of the things that is up for discussion in this book is the identity of Rabbit, because even the intelligence agencies cannot solidly confirm the identity of Rabbit. And that's who I'm sculpting here, is Rabbit. Because they're meeting largely in a digital space, and as I said, the world is largely an ephemeral one. But anyway, Rabbit is sort of the middleman, and there's actually layers of middlemen in this, but Rabbit is the one that we're introduced to. And that is where it starts to become interesting. And, sorry, my brain got lost in sculpting land there for a second. I need to be careful to keep the pace up, otherwise I'm not going to finish in time. I already see the clock and I'm like, blah. So anyway, Rabbit is hired to go after this biotech mind control stuff that's going on. But they don't fully trust Rabbit, and there's that whole question of, like, what is his motives and all that jazz. and it becomes a bit of a cat and mouse game. And through the plot, we find out that actually it wasn't an amateur thing, and it wasn't the Americans as they fear, which makes me laugh so hard because it's an American author, and you're like, come on, just I know you're sort of shyly admitting that the Americans are some of the worst for military operations, but come on, could you have just not owned it? And in the end, the villain of the piece, and we'll talk about whether or not he is a villain because he has good intentions, but effectively he is the functional villain of the piece, is the head of the Indian Intelligence Agency, which is disappointing in its oh, I forgot to turn mirror mode on. I could turn it on right this second, and I probably should turn it on right this second, but fuck it, at this point we're asymmetrical. Anyway, because it turns out that the head of Indian intelligence is actually running the PSYOP drug development program inside a US lab without the US's knowledge. And he's also hiding this from his other European allies. And so there's a sort of multi-layered espionage, mystery, thriller thing going on. And, as I say, with Rabbit involved and all that jazz. And this all culminates in a sort of heist scene where the characters go into the biolabs, and the main characters think that they're going in to... Well, initially the plan was to go in to fight this library project, because there's this whole project with the physical destruction of books to scan them digitally, right? Very much like the Google Books Archive project and stuff. And it's very much dealing with the difference between physical books and digital things, and the discoverability of digital versus the discoverability of analog. Like in a library, you're much more likely to hit on tangential topics, and should everything go into this mythical world without substance or form, that has also got proprietary company ownership, and he's dealing with a lot of topics in this book. There's a lot of stuff that he is diving into. So anyway, they're ostensibly going into this biolab to destroy some printing tech, but most of the people involved in this heist have been co-opted. The poet's being co-opted because he can't write poetry anymore because his drugs have slightly altered his brain chemistry, and he's been offered by Rabbit the ability to write poetry again. So it's all a multi-layered sort of fuck up, and the kids are involved, and his ex-wife and stuff. But honestly, that's just plot. It's not actually character development, and it's not actually some of the more interesting things the book's about, which is what I really want to dive into. So one of the mysteries of the book is, what is Rabbit's identity? Now, having read through the book, and especially having reread through the book with an eye to sort of thinking about who Rabbit is, I think there's really no mystery to it. I'm pretty convinced that Rabbit is an AI, like I hinted at earlier when I slipped up. It fits with the futurist thing. It's an idea that's even thrown about by some of the core characters, and especially at the end of the book when his trust apex and his security certificates get revoked, but he's able to sort of recover. And I would actually suggest that the other antagonist in the heist illusionary battle that happens is another AI. There's strong hints at that. So I think the identity of Rabbit can only be an AI. And that's really interesting, because I think sci-fi books, we have this history of AI, if not villains, drivers of story. Gibson did it all the time and stuff. So I think it's only in that tradition, and especially towards the tail end of the book, the espionage characters realize that while the bioterrorism thing that's going on. And the bioterrorism and the mind control stuff, the reason ostensibly why the Indian surveillance guy had his reasons as very 9/11 kind of thinking, which is why I'm like, come on, this totally should have been the Americans doing this. I understand why, because Americans are a big market and da, 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 da. But it was basically no, for the sake of national security, because there's all of these amateur chemists, and they're all cooking up bio threats, and you know, nukes can be 3D printed and all this kind of stuff, and that's ostensibly like why he's doing the things he's doing. And you're like, really? So it felt a bit thin on the ground for that, but whatever, it's acceptable. But they sort of realize at the end of the book, oh no, actually this whole time the thing we should have been worrying about was Rabbit, and Rabbit was actually the next big scary thing if we had been paying attention. And sort of the tail end of the book, it does suggest that they're doing some sort of cleanup or investigation on Rabbit. Whether or not they actually succeed in punishing or chasing down Rabbit is kind of left for the reader's imagination a little bit, because it's done off screen. But you know, it's clearly something that's happening. Brains, sorry, there we go, cool. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting book. There's a lot of individual things we can dive into. So the thing that I have to admit was the first thing that attracted me to the book was the whole localizer XR stuff, which, looking back on it, isn't actually the most interesting thing in the book, which is fascinating, because I thought we would reach the end of the book, and I thought the topic of conversation when we talked about this book would largely be the augmented reality, virtual reality technology in this book, because it is the thing that initially drew me quite strongly to the book. It was recommended to me by Perlin, and he was doing a bunch of VR work, and we were chatting about VR stuff, and he's a fascinating chap, and I know I've mentioned his work before. The most computer science people will recognize him from the technology Perlin noise. But yeah, no, so he fascinating chap, and so yeah, I thought, oh dear, that needs to be scoped into his jacket. Go. So I thought that would be the draw and the thing we'd be talking about. Turns out not. Turns out the thing that really grabbed me, it's potentially because of the coronavirus and a bunch of silly conspiracy theories and stuff going around. I was like, well, actually, this whole bioterrorism and the identity of Rabbit is very interesting itself. Which, yeah, I find fascinating, because it's not what I thought we would be going into the book, and we'd be talking about. But there you are. Though I think it does bear mentioning, because the practical, and here's the thing about the stuff mentioned in the book about augmented reality is, and looking back on it, it's such a silly thing to obsess about when the book's got so many other interesting topics in it. We were talking about the difference about inside-out tracking and outside-in tracking, and the fact that inside-out tracking is always going to be the most sort of convenient. There we go, we got Rabbit there. I'm going to leave him up there for a sec, and we're going to wrap up. Inside-out tracking is always going to be the most convenient form of tracking, because it travels with you. It just naturally solves a lot of problems, because what you can see is what it can track, and what you can see is the stuff that has to be accurate. But there's a lot of limitations, and the biggest limitation is when you're trying to share a reality with other people. And left monitor, when you're trying to share a reality with other people, and that's where localizer nodes and local area networks and point-to-point laser networking communication, all that kind of stuff comes in together to make a shared reality a much easier possibility. I'm just going to save that thing off now because we're running over time. And so I found that fascinating, and I think considering he wrote this book before the Vive and the Lighthouse trackers were a thing, I mean, it's an obvious kind of extension, but he really kind of did hit it on the nose, and I think it does paint somewhat of a roadmap going forward long term for augmented and virtual reality technology. I think inside-out tracking is going to be a staple, but for high-quality experiences, especially any kind of shared space experiences, outside-in tracking a la Lighthouse or forms of the Lighthouse are going to become a more important element for everyone. So I did find that fascinating. And as I say, the identity of Rabbit, big deal. The rereading it, the sadness of the aging problem and how aging people deal with technology is, I think, a fascinating element to the book. And yeah, while the identity of Rabbit is painted up in this huge mysterious way, I think I can safely say I'm firmly planting my flag in the AI camp. If anyone else read it, I can go into why I think so. There's particular passages, but if they dispute that. But having said all that, it was really exciting. I don't know if the book club thing's going to work, but I'm going to continue it. And I will be posting the next recommendation on Twitter today because I just need to confirm the author's name and everything because it's out of my head at the moment. Other books I have recently been rereading because I've been trying not to keep my mind too busy, and I find rereading books kind of a comfort thing when I'm busy at work. The Bromhiliad trilogy by Pratchett, that's the Truckers, Diggers, Wings trilogy. Dodger by Pratchett, which is a very interesting look into Victorian London. And I reread a Gemmell recently that I forget. But yes, Rainbow's End, strong recommend. And yeah, it's fascinating how it dives into all those things. But I think the main interest is the ephemerality of technology as it develops and how old people deal with changing tech. So, having said that, for those of you on YouTube, thanks for joining us. This is a live show, 8:30 every morning, and if you come join us, you can talk to us live. And I'm going to go talk to chat now, but you're not here, so you miss out. Ta-ta for now.